Let's begin. The threats are: Queen takes pawn, check. Here are checks in puzzle position. Knight to c6, check. Knight to g6, check. Queen to g5, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h4, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to e1. Queen takes rook, check. King takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Knight takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes bishop, check. The checks are: knight to c8, check. Knight to f5, check. Queen to f6, check. Queen takes bishop, check. Answer to this puzzle is queen to f6, check. King to f8. Queen takes bishop, checkmate. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes rook. Knight takes rook, check. King to e1. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. Knight takes pawn. Next, threats in this position are: rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: g6, check. Rook to e5, check. Rook to f4, check. The puzzle is solved using king to f7, h4, g6, checkmate. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is e4. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. King takes bishop. Next, the threats are: knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. Here are the checks. Knight to d5, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight to b5, check. Knight to d5, check. The answer is knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Rook to b1. Queen takes rook, check. Knight takes queen. One more. Threats in this position are: there are no threats in this position. The checks are: f6, check. Knight to e6, check. Knight to h5, check. The puzzle is solved using f6, check. King to h7. King takes pawn. Rook takes knight. g6, check. King to h6. g7. Rook to a4. Promotes to queen. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Bishop to g5. Rook takes queen. Bishop takes queen, check. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are: rook takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn, check. The answer is rook takes knight. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes pawn, check. King to g1. Knight to h3, check. Rook takes knight. Bishop takes rook, check. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes pawn. The checks are: queen to b2, check. Queen to b1, check. The answer is queen to b1, check. King to d2. Rook to d8, check. King to e3. Queen takes rook. Another puzzle. Here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. Here are the checks. Knight to a5, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. g6. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: knight takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to e2, check. Knight to e4, check. The best move in puzzle position is knight to e4, check. Queen takes knight. Queen takes bishop, check. f4. Pawn takes queen. Pawn takes queen. Pawn takes bishop. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Rook takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to f7, check. Queen to f8, check. Solution to the puzzle is knight to f4. Queen to f5. Knight takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes queen. Rook takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is queen takes queen. Pawn takes queen. Bishop to d4. Bishop to e3. Bishop takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are queen takes pawn, check. Queen to b3, check. Rook to c3, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to c3, check. Rook to f3. Rook takes rook, check. Bishop takes rook. Queen to h2, check. King to g4. Queen to g3, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is rook to c3. Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is queen takes pawn. Queen to b1, check. King to g2. Rook to c2, check. King to h3. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Bishop to d3, check. Rook to h6, check. Answer to this puzzle is bishop to d3, check. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes rook. One more, let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are bishop to h4, check. The answer is bishop to h4, check. King to f1. Bishop takes rook. King takes bishop. g5. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Next, here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes rook, check. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. f2, check. Rook to g2, check. Rook takes rook, check. Solution to the puzzle is f2, check. King to f1. Bishop to c4, check. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are queen to c2, check. Queen to c1, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes knight. Pawn takes knight. Next puzzle, the threats are rook takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is knight to c6. Rook to f5, check. King to g6. Bishop to f4. Rook takes bishop. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes queen, check. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in this position are queen takes queen, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Rook takes rook, check. King to f2. Pawn takes queen. King takes rook. Pawn takes pawn. One more, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. The checks are knight to f3, check. Knight to e2, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight to e2, check. King to g2. Queen to d5, check. Queen to f3. Rook takes queen. One more, puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes rook. The checks are rook to f8, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is pawn takes rook. Rook to e8. Bishop to c1. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.